Hi, welcome to another episode of On Transit, the TV show On Transit that takes place on transit.
This is the second episode of On Transit devoted to STPP Partners Workshop, the Surface Transportation Policy Partnership. Workshop is called Moving from the Margins to the Mainstream. In this episode, I interview some of the people who came to Minneapolis for that workshop.
I'm Ann Canby, the head of Surface Transportation Policy Project and Advocacy Coalition in Washington, D.C. And we're holding a series of workshops around the country, regional workshops, to help advocates and agency folks and others, local officials, understand better how to use federal transportation dollars to support and enhance and build livable communities, healthy, safe, walkable, transit-oriented communities.
It's very exciting to speak to other groups around the country that are working on similar campaigns. One of the things I did hear this morning was a number of the other cities are looking at sales tax increases, that type of thing, to fund transit, and that's something. It's also a major part of TLC and the broader transit advocacies group's agenda in the metro areas.
We've been working over the last decade really to craft a vision for our region for an expanded, enhanced public transportation system, and that vision is now taken on the name of the Smart Moves Plan. We've been working over the last couple of years across the community to bring shape to that plan, and we now have a fairly good agreement around the community that that's the vision that makes sense for our region. What our focus is on now is raising the resources that would let us implement that.
Madison actually has transit ridership comparable to cities 2 or 3 times its size. Part of it has to do with our geography because of the way we're located on an isthmus between 2 lakes, and as a result I think that creates some density and also some really strong transit corridors.
The advantage about Duluth is that it never lost its dependency on public transit. The system never went down and then had to be built back up. The city always maintained it. So we have a very, very aggressive transportation program, public transit program in Duluth. We transport over 3 million passengers a year in a population of, in the Duluth proper, less than 85,000, which is unheard of.
A lot of people use transit for commuting, obviously. Madison Metro has a fairly substantial ridership over some primary routes from outlying areas into downtown. But it's also an all-the-time transit system. It covers most of the city of Madison and is heavily used. I think, as I was saying to somebody else today, we have a very good conventional city bus service, but we're reaching the limits of what you can accomplish just with the conventional city bus service, and that's why we're looking at other options like rail.
It's a lot of great ideas. It's just a matter of taking these ideas and then implementing them within our communities, and that's going to be the real challenge, I think, getting community buy-in and business buy-in and getting all these different groups to come together and to request these sorts of options and getting where they're going.
Congestion is coming to Duluth, believe it or not. There's a new, I guess, emphasis on bringing housing back into the downtown area. Again, following pretty much what the metro area is doing. A lot of condo construction here. That's going on in Duluth also, certainly not on the same scale, but we have a lot of the same issues that accompany that, and that is how are people going to get from basically point A to point B. You have to look at the different mix of people that ride the bus. We have the seniors, we have the students. We have a very successful college pass program. We're transporting probably 40,000 students a month to the university. And then you have the commuters, people that need to get back and forth on a daily basis. And now with of course, the recent spike in gasoline prices, I used to say that the sort of the tipping point for people paying attention to public transit was about $1.50 a gallon. That's now doubled. It's up around $3. So people have adjusted their travel habits. They've adjusted their spending habits. But I think if this continues, that we're going to see some new emphasis on how does public transit respond to these emerging needs. And of course, we're looking at that very, very carefully because we know it's going to be affecting us in Duluth also.
In terms of transportation, we do work around policies, around demonstration projects that will demonstrate the effectiveness of those policies, and then information technology transfer kind of approach. So what we learn, we can easily share with other people.
One of the things Madison has going for it is that it has some existing rail corridors that are currently used by some limited freight service that radiate in all directions from the downtown area out towards some of the primary commuting suburbs, towns like Sun Prairie, Stoughton, Middleton, and so forth. Those rail corridors in that respect are just where we need them to start to provide a really quick way for people to get from outlying areas into the central downtown Madison area. What they don't do necessarily is get people directly to their downtown destinations, which is why the mayor of Madison is very enthusiastic about streetcars along the lines of the streetcar that's being talked about in Portland. That would provide a circulator in the immediate downtown area. So those are the two projects, and they're both of them. The streetcar line project is right now in the early stages of a feasibility study. The commuter rail regional transit proposal is actually now in the stages of trying to reach a final decision on what we would take forward into a preliminary engineering process. We've already had a series of preliminary feasibility studies showing that it could work. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty details of what exactly we want to take to the federal government as a proposal for potential federal funding.
Metro Transit being a regular route transportation system, but now also offering commuter services and carpooling, van pooling, and in charge of the fare structure and special passes, things of that sort, as well as Metro Mobility. We already provide a large portion of the public transportation in the city, but we also have a whole network. In Hennepin County alone, almost 70 different providers, both private and public, that provide door-to-door dial-a-ride service, medical assistance, social service transportation for the Department of Human Services. All these areas are spending anywhere from a few dollars a ride up to $75 a ride. And most of it is government funded, or at least subsidized in one way, shape, or another. So the better we can coordinate that, get more rides for less money and a better quality ride, that's basically what I'm charged with doing.
How do we better meet the needs of people who cannot drive because of disabilities or because they're too old or too young and are disabled in some way from driving? There are a lot of resources in our communities that go because of through the private sector for healthcare, travel to and from healthcare, that are privately funded. And one of the questions that was raised today is how can we combine all those resources and be more efficient and yet better meet the needs of people, for example, who may not be able to drive to the hospital or maybe as seniors choose not to drive anymore. So it's looking at ways to better serve the community, but at the same time be efficient with our resources and in fact address some of the really big problems in our region and our world, such as the coming energy shortage, climate change, and looking at some of the environmental issues that we've got here because of the way our transportation system is out of balance.
We pay our gas tax at the gas pump, and it funds, at least in Wisconsin, predominantly roads. And as a result of the way the transportation dollars are spent, we end up with a transit system in many communities that doesn't really adequately serve the needs of the people. And at the same time, we end up with roads that in frequent cases are built far beyond the necessary capacity. I mean, we've got roads to places in Wisconsin that you may or may not have heard of, like Dodgeville to Dickeyville, where the average hourly traffic count is measured on two hands rather than with a calculator. And so that shows us, I think, that the kinds of dollars that we're putting into some of our transportation choices are dominated more by the road builders than what people are really demanding.
There's often a perception from communities of color that when transit cuts happen, when transit decisions happen, that they're not involved in the process, and so transit cuts are that impact them more. That's a common thing that we hear. Another thing is that when transit corridors are being developed, that communities of color aren't being involved in the process, and often transit corridors will gentrify their communities and displace them. There won't be stops at the proper places. The economic development that happens is for other people who are coming in, and it'll displace them, and that the jobs that are created won't be jobs for them. A real concern about that. There's of course also a real recognition that transit's important for communities of color and low-income people, because they need it to get to their jobs, to their housing, to their doctor's appointments, to entertainment. And so there's a need for more transit for those purposes, and I would say biking and walking as well, although often the conversations are often more constrained to just transit, but this really applies to a broader set of transportation options.
One of the interesting things we've learned as we've gone through this process was how important transit is, but how difficult it is to engage people at the community for a couple of reasons. One, when you think about it, human service providers can know that transportation is a problem, but they don't know that they can do anything about it. So they tend to say, transportation, that's an issue that's over here. We know there are very low-income people who can't afford cars. We know there are seniors who have no ability to get around without transit. We know that there are disabled populations who need transit. But you know, transportation is hard, and it's complicated, and it's full of jargon, and it's really expensive. So we just can't go there. So what we've been trying to do is pull them in and say, there's a voice, you know, they're really, these decisions are being made, and they're being made saying that they've got civic input, but that means they have a public hearing, and 3 people come and they vent, and that's considered public input. It's got to be more than that.
It's been good to hear that other people have the same kind of concerns that I do. I've heard from some people that are involved in policy that they believe that community involvement is very important and that they should be involved at an early stage in the process. It's been interesting for me to hear about ways of creating kind of multiple types of transportation along one corridor, so perhaps there's a way to, create walkways or bikeways to accompany the transit along University.
The trails are used very heavily. They're most people consider it a huge asset to the community. We're all about preserving the wetlands and the ecology, and then getting the people out on the recreational areas. When they're trying to sell their house, they'll say within 3 blocks of the trail, and that's a good feature that people look for when they come to move into the community.
Our concerns are what happens when some of the public needs, and I'm talking about shopping, medical needs, and so forth, are diminishing in the smaller communities, and those people then have to migrate into the larger suburban areas, which in this case is Duluth, to get those basic needs to sustain, a quality of life. So we're addressing that with the regional carrier up there, which is Arrowhead Transit. They bring people into Duluth. They connect into our system at a transit hub. So we're really ahead of the game a little bit, and we're just looking at what more we can do to address some of those needs.
The idea of the session is to bring some information and to have the participants, or the attendees really, be participants, I think is the way to look at it. And we've been able to do that. People have been engaged. I think we've been able to learn from each other. And I think we are working towards developing an agenda for the future.
This has been a very interesting gathering. I was telling one of the sponsors that my mind wanders a lot during the discussions, and I find myself jotting notes to myself of things that I should go back home and work on, where this has really sparked an idea of something we could do differently and perhaps better.
It's been very productive, a lot of dialogue, connecting, people having the same ideas about how to work together. One of the issues that have come out is really the need to educate And I think that we've all learned that we've got to go back and educate everyone about what's out there, what we need, and the needs of the people, and really to put a face on it. And I think often as policymakers, we don't do a good enough job of putting a face on it, and I think that that will help us get the mobility that we need across the nation.
And there are a lot of agencies that wasn't really aware of that we could probably partner with and get more accomplished and maybe get things done a little sooner.
It's really a very thought-provoking, very dynamic session. I've found it to be a really nice interlude. I have a huge stack of work at the office, and it's nice to be able to set it aside for a few hours and just think a little bit, more widely about how to better provide transportation alternatives and services.
And again, some of the federal funding stuff, it sneaks down to the local communities through the Metropolitan Council, our planning agency here for the metro area, and through Hennepin County. So it's very interesting, and it's helpful for me to kind of get the background for that as we look forward to when I hear something about the safety loo or the ICT grants, some of those things now. At least I'm going to understand a little bit more about where that funding is originating and how it's filtering through the system to get back down to the residents that I work for.
I think just in the last 3 or 4 years there's a growing understanding, and I heard it today in lots of different ways, that we have to break through that sense of transit is a whole other world. And so that's a real hopeful thing that I took away from today, because I believe you can learn to talk about anything, but you've got to get real intentional about the learning. So that's what I was hearing in the group today, is a much greater interest in, first of all, if we're going to get the money that we need for this, we've got to get people engaged. Then they have to talk to their legislators, and you've got to have that real loop of advocacy for transportation.
One of the things that I'm struck by is just the two things: the complexity of the situation in terms of federal funding, the challenges involved in getting federal funding, and also the range of different projects and programs that are available for funding transit. In preparation for the conference, we were sent a booklet enumerating all the different projects. I tend to get focused on a particular set of projects related specifically to funding for commuter rail or streetcars. What I'm hoping to learn from this, and what I'm already learning a great deal about, is the range of different little programs that come together to form this federal transit funding package. And so I'm hoping to come away from this conference with a much broader knowledge of the funding opportunities out there, and really to begin thinking about transportation and transit in a broader sense than just a particular project.
President Bush and, in fact, Governor Pawlenty 2 years ago started the United We Ride program for Minnesota. It's nationwide to push coordination, but when Safety Lou was written into law last August, one of the aspects that's written throughout the law that's different from the previous ICT regulations is that it requires anybody receiving federal funds under this to have a coordination component in their activities and their contracts and everything else. So that just puts greater emphasis on the work I'm doing of trying to get people to coordinate so they can use the federal money in one way and also just be more efficient.
Well, just education in general. I've been attending neighborhood association meetings and doing doing presentations on. Specifically, there's a proposed beltway in the northeast part of Polk County, and we're educating about that. You'd be surprised how many people just don't know about the beltway, don't know about the comprehensive plan, and then don't know that there are ways to get involved. And I let them know different roundtables, discussion groups they can join, different meetings that are coming up, and it's just. All the public input stuff that they don't do quite so good of a job as telling us about, that's kind of where I can step in and fill in those blanks.
There has been a general attitude that maybe we're at a limit on taxes, and I understand the motivations behind that, but there also are needs, public needs out there that need addressed at the same time. And it's interesting, one thing around the country is when you ask the public directly through transit ballot measures referenda if they would like to support additional transportation investments. The trend recently has been overwhelmingly yes, and 3 years in a row, over 75% of ballot questions that involve public transportation questions. Would you support this level of transportation investment additional through a sales tax or whatever, and are you willing, to pay for it through that sales tax? The answer over 70% of the time has been yes. Last year it was over 80%. So it seems like the public is willing to face that question straight up and establish what their transportation priorities are.
I think that we have now reached a point, and we maybe aren't fully there yet, but we're moving toward it, where the demographics of our country, with people getting older and wanting to have more travel options, with the price of energy rising recently quite a little bit and likely to continue, that the reliance on just the automobile is going to be maybe overtaken might be too strong a word, but clearly I think people are recognizing that having choices in terms of how to move, go from one place to another, is becoming increasingly important. And I think that's one of the things this is all about in this century. So having choices means having more transit, having land use patterns that support walking, origins and destinations that are within walking distance and bicycling distance, and maybe good transit services for slightly longer distances, but even rail for intercity travel, I think is something people very much want to see more of.
I think there's a lot of optimism at this conference that we're having transportation policy is shifting from a roads-only approach to a more diverse transportation choices being available and being implemented by federal legislators, by state legislators, by transit officials in various agencies. I see a lot of that, and I'm enthusiastic about that as well, and I think that's a great trend.
Well, I don't think it has fully played out at the federal level yet. It will happen the next time we have to reauthorize the federal legislation, which won't be for another couple of years. But there are more and more signs. I mean, the changes will begin to happen more out here in the cities and states around the country and be reflected in what gets done next in Washington.
I think it's been a very helpful session. It's great to get people from different states together to talk about their different experiences, learning from the successes here in the Twin Cities. The Hiawatha Line is an enormous draw and success. We'd love to duplicate the success of that in Milwaukee and maybe Madison, and I think that the Twin Cities has got a lot of traffic problems, but they've also got some real transportation successes. So it's good to learn that aspect of things here.
I love Minneapolis, and I'm a great transit rider. It was good coming over here on the bus. It was great coming in on the Hiawatha Line from the airport. I come from a city that has both of its airports connected by transit, and I don't find that in a lot of cities, so I appreciate the opportunity when I have it.
I'm very impressed with what I see in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You have a great bikeway system. In many ways, you have a very walkable community. You also have a transit system, that's good bus. I rode a nice bus connection from Minneapolis to St. Paul on the very corridor that the new rail line, the Central Artery, is going to be built. Also, I think people, once you see the great success of the Hiawatha Line, connecting all of the trip generators in the community, the Metrodome, the downtown, the airport, the Mall of America, the public has embraced that. You say, how does the politicians get the message? Well, I think people are voting with their feet. They're using the system. They're liking it. One comment that was made yesterday, the line was built with ridership projections. The line is already at ridership projections for the year 2025. They're way ahead of pace on transit here in Minneapolis, and I think that is being recognized.
I think it's been very instructive to hear about what's happening in other parts of the country and to hear about some of the problems that stand in the way of better transit around the country. I wish there'd been more of the rider's perspective. It was all rather top-down. But I think I've made some good contacts here, and it has been interesting.
My goal is to make public transit more attractive than owning the car in Duluth. One of the things we've done up there, and this was hit up on also, bicycles. Of course, this whole conference is about pedestrian bicycles and alternatives. And we've had bike racks on our buses in Duluth. We're probably one of the first agencies in the country to do that, and people just expect that now. We welcome them.
We were one of the first agencies to talk to MTC about bike racks on their buses. Initially, when they met with us, they had three major, very logical problems, but other agencies jumped on board, and now we see that they started out with a pilot project of one route had bike racks on them, and now over a 5-year period, they have them on all the buses. And it's things like that that we're looking for.
Anything we can do to be more of a service to the public, that depending on public transportation, we're going to do it, and we're not afraid to do it. I hear constantly systems that are adverse to doing something that is going to make it more difficult operationally, like putting bike racks on buses. We have no problem with trying anything that's going to get somebody out of their car onto a bus.
Well, I don't like to drive, is one reason. I care about the environment. What we're doing with relying on fossil fuels is, creating a situation that's not going to be sustainable for the future.
All those things work together, bike, pedestrian, transit, because collectively they can make the community that allows you to get around. In many places you might not need an automobile, and if you need one, you can rent one for the weekend. But I think that collectively those three coalitions to work together.
Yeah, I just want to see further growth for the alternative transportation choices and get people out of their cars. It's both for commuting and for exercise.
I think if your viewers who are looking at this, you have the understanding that they can make a difference, that none of the issues that we deal with are impossible to change, but they're not going to change unless the people speak out. So I would encourage everyone to be involved in the transportation planning process.
It's up to us to make our communities be the way we want them and not leave it just to people in agencies. They need support from people like us on the outside, articulating our vision for our communities as we go forward.